Hello and welcome to Property Matters, a weekly look at all matters property designed to be of interest to anyone who has an interest in property. Property Matters is supported by Fairview International Property Consultancy and auctionproperty.co.uk. Each week we're looking at those big stories of the week, and this week is no exception. And of course we'd love you to get involved in the stories with your comments in the comment section below wherever you're watching us today. And of course don't forget to like our page and subscribe so you get notifications of when we're live. And if you want to get in touch, propertymatterstv@gmail.com. Joining us as always, our expert on property, Joe Joshi. Morning, Joe.
Good morning. I'm not sure about the expert, but I'll try and work on that one the best I can. I suppose having spent a lot of years in it does give me some sort of credibility about being the expert. But thank you very much for that.
Every week now for all getting on for 2 years, we've put your knowledge to the test, and you've never let us down so far. So let's just see how we get on today. Here's your starter for 10. Average UK annual rental growth has reached a 14-year high. Rents now increasing to £995 in quarter one 2021, and an extra £88 a month compared with the start of the pandemic, says the new research from Zoopla. The latest research from the property portal reveals that the average rent is up 11% year on year, but there are growing signs the market is nearing its peak as the cost of living crisis continues to put increased pressure on renters. And in London, the proportion of salary that goes in rent is now up to 52%, which is quite significant for a single earner, reflecting the fact that the new let agreed on average rental property in London will cost around £20,000 to rent over the next 12 months. So it's not cheap, and it's not going to be good news for those that are saving for a deposit by renting, is it, Joe?
No, I mean the rental market is really on fire at this precise moment in time. It's now taken a bit of a reversal role to the last couple of years when the sales market was actually booming because of the pandemic and people wanted to move and so forth. But now that we've come through the pandemic, there is people wanting to move back into certain areas, especially for work and so forth. And all of a sudden, they're finding that there's been a shortage of rental properties, primarily due to the fact that a lot of people, there was a time when people moved much regularly, Paul, so there was always an availability of properties. But what has happened during the pandemic, a lot of people stayed put. And so subsequently, there wasn't enough availability. And because there was no buildings going on and nobody was really moving forward, it meant that there was a lack of supply and demand. And the supply got reduced, and the demand obviously is now way ahead of what the supply is, and subsequently it's always down to supply and demand, and now rent prices are going up because the good quality, the good properties that are available, landlords can demand higher prices. You also got to bear in mind that whilst that the tenant is liable to pay the utilities in terms of the gas and the electric and maybe the water and maybe the rates, etc. All of those combined and the upgrade of the interest rate lately has meant that landlords are having to, especially on buy-to-let mortgages, the rates are obviously a little bit higher than they would be on a privately owned property. All of that it's like passing it down the line. So it's going to be passed to the tenant, and subsequently £88, £90, £100 a month is now been added to the bottom line bill for those people. And of course the utilities have added their bit, and hence where we are in terms of inflation, because at the end of the day everything is going up, and it's all blamed or due to the pandemic and due to the Ukraine war and many other things that have actually happened. But yeah, I mean, rental prices have gone up, and it's down to the fact that it's about, and also it's about the quality, Paul. It's about, if it's a good property and the landlord has looked after it well, then he's going to command, and the tenants are going to pay because they want a nice, clean property to rent.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because it looks like we're going to get a repeat of the situation across the pandemic. I'll come on to that in a minute. You said a moment ago that the average percentage of the gross annual salary is about 52%. And across the country elsewhere, it's around 37% for a single earner. And I didn't know this, around a third of renters actually live alone, according to the English Housing Survey. Um, but rental growth has grown back strong in London from falls of 10% last year. Average rental growth in the capital rose to 15% at the end of Q1. I think that was supposed to say 2022 actually on the screen there. I think there's a misprint in the article looking at it there. I'm sure that must say that. But that's obviously because of the demand from international students coming back and office workers and so on. But interesting, the point I wanted to get to, and the thing that really was interesting to me, was that a lot of renters are deciding to renew early because they want to avoid the flux that's coming in the market as they perceive it. So they want to lock in a longer period, just as you were saying. People during the pandemic, they're wanting to stay longer because they want to weather out this storm, knowing that their rent isn't going to increase. Because if they decide to move during the next few months, they're going to have to face a much higher rent.
Absolutely, and of course the interesting thing about that is that when you've got a landlord who says, I've got a tenant, they've been a good tenant for X, Y, Z. It's better. I suppose it's the old adage: it's the better the devil you know situation, and you know that it's reliable, it's coming through, and therefore you don't really want to upset the apple cart by hiking their rent by another £50 to £100 because someone somewhere has to sort of wear that cost, but people will look at it. I suppose the other way to look at it is that by the time you've actually had a tenant vacate and then had a new one in, if you look at all the costs that are implied and the void period potentially that could happen. So you could have a month of void period or two months of void period when something didn't rent, or if the property was in such poor condition that you had to go and spend time getting it renovated, so forth, and that's another void period. And to make matters worse, there are not enough tradespeople out there at this moment in time. So I know work is fully loaded for those guys, and either they're going to charge you more money, or they're not going to meet within your timescale. So again, there's a void period. So the question you have to ask yourself at that point, a pragmatic question, is that do I stay with what I've got and increase it by another 6 months, 12 months, a year, or 2 years, whatever I can, or do I kick them out, give them notice, and then start again? But that starting again means that I've actually got to invest more money back into getting some of that back. So it's a real financial quandary that you have to sort of take on board at that time.
Yeah, they say UK tenants are staying in their rental properties for an extra 5 months on average compared to 5 years ago, with the average tenancy length up to 75 weeks, which used to be 51 weeks at the start of 2017. And this has been agreed by Rightmove. They've also found that tenants are looking to stay in their rental properties for longer to avoid higher rents because of the changes in inflation, etc. And Foxtons have said that the tenancy renewal numbers that they've seen so far this year are unprecedented. Steadily increasing demand, very limited stock, and a swift rise in rental prices are all compelling reasons to renew, and renters are responding. They've seen a 29% at Foxtons rise in renewals year on year versus last year, and they're also choosing these longer tenancies to avoid the market flux. Deals have gone up 9% in 2022, reaching an average tenancy now of 15.7 months. That's the average people will rent for.
Yeah, I mean, it's the longevity, it's the uncertainty that they face in either the rent increasing or actually also whether they would find another property in a similar location at a better price. And that also has, I mean, if you've got your communication and your whole world is set around where you are, whether it's the local Tesco superstore or the pharmacy that you use or the doctors, there's a whole bunch of things that actually start to relate to that move. It's not just as mobile as one would like to think it if you are there on a long term. I mean, if you're just staying, a couple of weeks, 3 months, so forth, then your Airbnb maybe might be the best option. You go in there for 3 months and off you go. But anyone that is looking at a 6 months, 12 months option, they are looking at, settling down in some shape or form for that period. Equally, I know settling down for 6 months, 12 months may not be, but it's also learning about the persons or the partners that you're working with, or where you are, your job. All of those things start to become part of the decision making. I noticed you said that the research showed that most people are single, um, and
Well,
yes, there are,
a third of them are single.
yeah, a third of them are single people. That isn't it amazing to think that let's take a one bedroom apartment, and a one bedroom apartment on the average could cost you, £1,000 a month, and if your salary is, you're bringing home 15, 16, £1,700 a month, you haven't got a great deal to sort of live with. But people find it difficult to now live with people as opposed to living on their own. Going back 30, 40 years, it was the norm, absolutely the norm, that you'd buy a two-bedroom house or a two-bedroom flat or whatever,
Mm.
and you know that you're going to rent the other two rooms out. But as time has gone on, we have become more independent, more insular, more, whatever other words you want to find that allows us to say, I don't want anybody else here. I don't want to share this with someone. And that only the sharing part of it mostly happens in the bigger cities, where it becomes very difficult to find the money and the accommodation on your own at an affordable price. So you end up renting a room, for example, and then, I mean, I've spoken to people where they say, I wish I had a garden. When you have a room, I wish I had a living room. When I had a living room, I wish I had a garden. When I have a garden, I wish I didn't have a garden because I know how to cut the grass. It's just there's always I wish, and in an ideal world, we wish that all the things come together. But it is about what the pocket can afford.
I guess when you think about it, the size of the one bedroom and two bedroom apartments has got smaller and smaller. So you're more under each other's feet if you had to share. And of course, now working from home as well, people need their privacy and the ability to make a phone call while somebody else is literally in the same room as you could be quite disturbing. So it's not surprising people are on their own, interestingly. But if you go and have a look at the situation for dual joint income earners, so in other words, two people sharing a flat together, the average rent accounts for about 19% of salary for two people. Best places to do that, somewhere like Great Yarmouth, for example, in the east of England, South Somerset and Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. Those are good places where rents are very good and affordable at the moment. Best place in London is Bromley, where it's just 19% of gross income. And it's still very much dependent on where you are in the country. Places like the Lake District, Whitehaven, Cleaton Moor, and places like that, they are all good places to rent. So we'll watch that one with interest, Joe. And of course, this is a bit of a rental special. I perhaps should have headed that up at the beginning because all of our items today concern landlords and tenants and the renting environment. And of course, as anyone that follows the property industry will know, the Renters Reform Bill, more information coming out about that this week. Of course, this is where the government proposes to scrap Section 21 and strengthening even Section 8 remain. They're part of the government's core proposals for this. When they first announced this back in 2019, of course, recent announcements have included extending the decent home standard to cover the private rented sector and introducing landlord redress via the establishment of a private renters ombudsman. They're thinking about a property portal to help landlords understand their obligations, give tenants performance information to hold their landlord to account, and help councils crack down on poor practice. It's no wonder so many landlords, apparently, we're led to believe, are leaving the profession.
Yes, I think obviously there is a level of change required. I'm not particularly confident that this particular change is it's a bit like a sledgehammer to beat a nail. It's just too much in one shot. They got to make some changes, but I think they could make some changes within the existing section. So just to break that down a little bit. For those that are watching, listening, Section 21 is the current notice period. If you are a landlord, you have to give 2 months' notice at a minimum for your tenant to leave, and you don't particularly have to give a reason for why they need to leave. You could simply say, I've decided to not rent the property anymore, so here's my notice, and off you jolly well go. And of course, the tenant has the right to give you 1 month's notice. So there is already a little bit of unfairness already that exists there, because all of a sudden a tenant could say, I'm going in a month's time, and as a landlord you have budgeted and planned for your costing and your expenditure and so forth over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months maybe. But now all of a sudden in a month's time, this property is going to become vacant because your tenant is going. And some will say, thank God, and blissfully be happy to have the keys back. Others may say, oh, great, that means it's going to be empty for a month. So they give you a month's notice, then it's empty for maybe a month, then you've got to do a little bit of refurbishing. So theoretically, you could be empty for 3 months before the next person comes in. So that's a 3-month potential rent void that you've got to now stomach and take on board. So that is the current situation. It gets worse in my mind when you take the Section 21 out and says, well, you now got to turn around and say there has to be a arbitration of why you want that property back, and the tenant has more rights because they may want to stay there, but they may stay there for all the wrong reasons, and you might have them in there for all the wrong reasons, but you're absolutely stuck in a marriage between a landlord and a tenant that actually neither of you actually don't want to be part of anymore. But the system says that the landlord would have to write to the tenant, giving them reasons why they want them out. The tenant may or may not accept those reasons, and it may end up in some sort of legal battle or court, and therefore it's not as clean as the current Section 21 is, albeit it is tipped towards the tenant side. At least a landlord knows that if he does give them 2 months' notice, theoretically they can go. If they don't go, he's on the treadmill of going to court and getting a possession order. To get a possession order as time goes on in Section 8 is going to become even a bigger challenge. So that's probably part of the reason why a lot of people are beginning to sort of saying, I'm going to run from this. And yes, for a short time, a bit like the pandemic, you're going to get the whole people changing their views and so forth. Then 2 years down the road, it will settle down and it will become the norm. But it's the 2 years between now and whenever this bill gets passed and we get on it is going to be the time that is going to absolutely muck up the rental market and give people all that sleepless time and uncertainty as to what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong thing to do here. So yes, it's good that the government are trying to do something. I mean, having a portal and telling tenants what is and what is an expectation and so forth is as bad as going to the restaurant and saying to the chef, if you don't put X, Y, Z into this, I'm not going to eat it, and if it's not done, I'm not going to pay for it. It's just ludicrous. At what point do you stop, and at what point do you start? And I think that we can actually almost overcook it, and the government can overcook it. And what is a good income for both potential landlords and the government, they could end up shooting themselves in the foot, because there will be people that will exit this market. The only thing that is going for it is that the only safest investment that ever exists in the United Kingdom is property. So they're drawn back into it, irrespective of all the hassle and all the trouble that it may actually bring when these circumstances happen. But it is the case that that's what they want. They want to try and so they're using a massive, great yardstick to beat up what is a good market, a good property section. People want a home, they want to rent, landlords want to buy and invest because there is no other investment. The government does very well out of that, by the way, too well to actually mention. They always never want to tell you the numbers. But I always say, just imagine that the amount of deposits that the government now holds in its deposit schemes is quite a staggering amount. In fact, I think it's worth us looking at that research as an average thing to work out what they're doing at. But let's say there was 2 million properties rented out, and there was £1,000 per property. They've got a lot of property every month that they hold that deposit for, which they use. But I'm saying 2 million is probably a small number. It's probably like more like 10 million that have been actually, rented out. And so it's a huge amount of income that the government has, and so they use that as another yardstick to say, oh, we could do this and we could do that. But I don't think they're looking at the longevity pool. I mean, I think that it's just they're doing something because they said they would do something, but I'm not sure
Well, when
it's
you
the
look
right
at
thing.
it, the government are saying that private. The wording was private landlords will no longer be able to evict tenants from their homes at short notice and without good reason. I mean, that's just a vote-winning piece of text. That is, if ever I saw one. But the point I wanted to pick up on was actually deposits you mentioned a moment ago, because that was going to be the next thing. Because the one thing that's gone really quiet in the latest proposals is the idea of lifetime deposits. Now, this was something that you could have a deposit that went with you from property to property. That idea seems to have literally disappeared from all the latest thoughts that the government are having. So it doesn't look like that one's going to get off the ground. What do you think?
Well, there's a reason why it's not going to get off the ground, because all of a sudden there's not going to be any more income coming in. You can't, say to somebody, well, there's £10 billion sitting in the deposit. That's all we're going to get, because each time somebody moves, they just move their deposit with them. So there has to be some comings and goings. There has to be a difference. Somebody might actually, move from a bigger house to a smaller house, or somebody might move from a smaller house to a bigger house. And therefore, the value of that deposit is going to be changing. So if you're paying £2,000 a month, your deposit is going to be, 2,000. Well, it's going to be probably £4,000. It's normally 6 weeks worth of deposit. That's just going to sit there. Now, if you're having £1,000 a month, you've only got £1,500, £1,600. So why should they want to consider a lifetime deposit when they know that they're actually going to shoot themselves in the foot for that part of it? So I think this is what I'm saying. The government is, whilst we're not being political, any government that looks and plays with the property market, they play with it sometimes without thought and more about themselves. But there's going to be a lot of people that are actually going to get injured in this situation. And some of the things are the most basics. And the problem is that the market and the media actually gives landlords, ideas that they think that could work, and ultimately they're not the right ideas. And of course, it's giving the government the same thing. They're saying that do this and do that, and you can actually make this work. It's a home at the end of the day. People move into rental accommodation because they're not in a position to buy one themselves, or they haven't settled down in their life and they want a temporary accommodation. What is happening here is they're utilizing all of those emotions that people have and actually monetizing it by saying, you know what, we can do this, and we'll have this section, and we'll give them this notice, and we give the tenant more rights. If they give the tenants more right, the landlord said, well, it's not worth me being in this business. If I'm going to be stuffed with a tenant that doesn't pay my bills and do all the things that they're supposed to do, I'm not going to do any more rentals. So there's another landlord that's gone off the market. And the government is begging for properties to be brought into the market because they're not building enough to make sure that they can accommodate these people. I don't think a lot of thought has been given to some of these things, and they're probably given by people that have no idea on the front line. It's like you've become a general in the army or whatever, but without actually having the experience on the front line. You just did it because your colours were right and you fitted it, and you've got the right degrees and so forth, and you just elevated yourself to a general or a commander, but actually you haven't got a clue how to fight on the front, because if they put a sword in your hand, you wouldn't know how to kill a bloke. So this is the situation with governments. They put all these non-experienced leveling up goves and people like that in there who've never actually probably rented a damn house in his life.
Allegedly. I think the industry is very divided on this. I think everyone agrees, from what I'm reading, that for goodness sake, just give us some clarity. Tell us what's going on, because you've been dithering with this since Theresa May in 2019. It's 3 years now. Yes, we know that you're going to get rid of Section 21. You're going to strengthen 8. You may even bring in lifetime deposits. Who knows? I mean, they've already got a landlord register, for example, in Scotland. There's a rumour that might be part of it as well. We haven't even discussed that bit of it. But they're just saying, well, okay, give us what it is that we're going to have to be faced with and tell us when you want to bring it in, but don't give us hardly any notice, because it's going to cause, as much of the industry believes, widespread chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, landlord registers would be great because you could actually, track down. Sometimes you're finding properties that are sitting there doing nothing because the landlord hasn't got the money. There's an argument going on. Doesn't live in the country. It could be anything. So a register is always a good thing to have. At least be able to track down. And you may have a property that someone's desperate to rent or buy or whatever may be the case. But the rest of it, in terms of where they are and the clarity, it's, even though they've said this in the Queen's speech and potential white paper, I don't see that there is a clarity. I just think that this is just a poor excuse of mucking around with something that is actually not really broken. They could tweak the 21, but what they're doing is fixing something that isn't actually broken. Because how many years? I mean, I've done this now, as I always say, for nearly 40 odd years, over 40 years. That Section 21 situation hasn't changed for that period. It's worked. Mm-hmm. It may not fit at all. It may not work with everybody, but it's been working. So now are we fixing something that actually really isn't broke just because somebody said we're going to do something?
What they're talking about, obviously, is with this ombudsman. They're saying, well, that's a good idea because it would be good to cut the number of possession cases that are going to court. But of course, the thing that most people have found out during the pandemic and now subsequently is that the courts need reforming as well. There needs to be proper court reform on this issue as well. So just having an ombudsman to reduce the workflow to the court doesn't really solve the problem. It's like putting a plaster on a broken arm.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I just think they haven't really thought this through. I mean, the repossessions that will come in off the back of the backlog, not because they are current issues. The repossessions will get higher primarily because people were not in a position due to pandemic, losses of jobs, maybe in some cases, not being able to work, being ill, losing. I mean, look at the hospitality industry. It was just, right on its knees. Loads of people there just didn't know whether it was coming or going. So yes, they are probably in arrears. They probably didn't have the money to pay the rent. And of course, once the doors were open back again, the courts and the landlords were in there saying, well, you haven't paid for the last 6 months, I've got to get you out. So that repossession rate will go higher over the next year, 18 months, 2 years, because it's the backlog in the system. You go and talk to a court or speak to a solicitor, they're telling you that hearings aren't coming in for 3, 4, 5, 6 months down the road yet. You're not getting a hearing in that situation. So the whole thing is, and that is also used by perhaps tenants. They know that the hearing isn't going to be for another 6 months. They also know that they can't be kicked out. And of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg. Unless they get a possession order and they get out, the council will continue to turn around and say, you stay where you are, let the landlord suffer, because he can. He can
afford it. Yeah. There's another debate going on here as well, which is interesting, is the scrapping of Section 21 even lawful? Because there's a thing called, obviously, as you and I will know, business protection regulations. So, in other words, it's a fundamental right of an owner of a property to retain the right of ownership by common law. Therefore, the property owner may do with it as they please, and to dictate to you that you cannot have your property back when a termed contract expires is morally wrong and unlawful. What other industry permits a contract that has expired to not be enforceable at its end, which is an interesting point. We know a few lawyers, maybe we should get them in.
Yes, I doubt very much they'd want to sit there and challenge that one, but yes, we would definitely get a few lawyers in and get their opinion on this subject. But my view is that Section 21 can be tweaked in a more fairer, favourable way, but I don't think it's the right thing to abolish it altogether and then just put the whole right on the tenant's part and the land. And yes, that will deter people to start thinking, well, do I want to invest my money in a residential rental property that actually I could be stuck with a tenant that I don't particularly want?
Yeah, I mean, there was a suggestion that there might even be things like fixed term tenancies which expire on the last day of the contract, which will not require a notice to end as they will have ceased. So, therefore, you'll see the landlord asking for the property back so that they can sell it, and the government can't take that right of ownership away. So it's interesting to see how whether that will be challenged in the courts in any way. But one point that somebody made, which I thought was quite interesting, was it's quite interesting that in the month when the no fault divorce is being brought into the marriage contract, the equivalent of the PRS is being removed.
There you go. See, there's always a balance of the scales. That's why it's called legal.
Yeah, so I think we're waiting for more clarity on this from the government, and I think when we get that, that'll be the time to debate it further. But watch this space. Section 21 will cause quite a bit of change in the private rented sector, so we'll see what happens. And our last story on this, which I know you're keen to discuss, and certainly I am, because we've talked about the number of people when they come to later in life and maybe receive money and they're looking to do something with that money. And as you've said many a time, you can't put it in a building society or anything of an investment because the returns are just not there. So what do people do? They buy a property and become a part-time landlord because that's got to be easy, right? But then you get situations like this that we've got here, where a horrified landlord has blamed his letting agent after seeing the conditions his rented flat was left in when the tenant left after 5 years. Basically, to put no finer point on it, 4 to 5 tons, I think it was, of rubbish has been left in the property, and the tenant turned around to the landlord and said, here's your 400, keep the 400 quid deposit because you'll need that to get rid of all this mess. And you could see it on the screen there. So, I mean, that is, we all think, oh yeah, it'd be really easy, even especially if you get a managing agent to look after it for you, Joe. You just think, well, I can just sit back and just take the rental money. It's going to be easy in my retirement. But this is just a wake-up call, isn't it?
Yeah, very interesting. Good story to bring on board, and actually a good lesson to be learned from such a story, as far as I'm concerned. And it's the old adage here, I'm afraid. It's what you put into it is what you're going to get out of it. And so, yes, first of all, uh, without a shadow of a doubt, and I will endorse it time and time again, buying property, investment in property is undoubtedly the best form of investment you'll ever make. It's the safest investment you'll make. Yes, unfortunately, along that journey are going to be some good and bad times, highs and lows. And this is a good example of a low from a high. And so somebody's probably turned around and bought a property and decided that it's a good investment. I'll do what I can to get a return. It may be that it's going to be about their retirement. It may be because it's extra income. It may be because they had a windfall and thought, what do I do with it? The bank has given me 0.1%. I can get maybe 4 or 5, 6% return out of my investment. I've also got an asset. There's all sorts of scenarios that happen, and everybody wakes up with the ideal dream of I'm going to go and buy a property that I'm going to rent out. And then this happens. You get a tenant that is in there, and that tenant has caused that problem for a number of reasons. Probably in the first case, the tenant was probably not qualified by the letting agent as a correct tenant. It may be that that tenant has a history of hoarding, and we don't know. We don't even know that that tenant was a good tenant who had a good job and then lost that job and couldn't afford it. We don't know if that tenant actually had a fallout with the landlord for whatever reason. It may be that he wasn't in a position to pay his rent for a month or two and the landlord said no. So he decided, okay, well, tough luck. This is how I'm going to leave your property. There could be many reasons, but they happen partly because they're not managed correctly. And they're not managed because what happens is nowadays there's so many people that will manage things for next to nothing. So landlords will always look at the cheaper option. You can go online and manage your own property for, £15 a month if you wanted to. But the point with that is that you're not going to have the time. You might save that money up front at the beginning, but you're busy. You're a landlord with a full-time job. You're traveling around the country. You're going into the city for your job. You really haven't got time to actually go there and inspect the property and check it every so often. So you just hope and pray that that's going to be right. The tenant's going to be looking after it. Equally, you might employ a letting agent who may not be paid enough. And I'd say that very clearly. They're not paid enough in order to be able to want to or wish to go and manage it correctly. So back in the early days, they used to have 3 or 4 tiers of management styles. So the first one would be just introduction only. So, you'd find a tenant, you introduce it to the landlord, and you take your fee and say ta-ta and goodbye and thank you very much. But the landlord still feels at that point, but because that agent actually rented that property for me, that onus on looking after that property is on the agent because he's the one that found the tenant. The actual truth is it's not, because you chose a scheme that said, just introduce me to a tenant and I'm going to look after the rest of it. As a landlord, you don't have the time or the withal or have the knowledge of what to do in order to try and make sure you look after it. So the second part of it was, perhaps a rent collection and and sort of an introduction and so forth. So there's 3 or 4 tiers, and the landlords have always felt that the bottom tier is the easiest one. I've got an agent that's introduced me, and that's it. An agent says, actually, thank you very much. I don't want anything to do with it because I'm not gonna. I'm gonna go where I'm making more money. I'm not making anything here. I've done my bit. That's it. And that's when this disparity happens, and the system falls, and landlords and tenants and agents tend to fall out because the landlord thinks that the agent should be looking after it. The agent says you're not paying me enough to look after it, and the tenant in the middle says, well, if the two of you are fighting, I couldn't give a monkey. I'm going to live like what I want to live like. And here is what he wants to live like: 4 tons of rubbish in the accommodation. Now you say to yourself, well, we've got a deposit to hold, so we can take that. Do you know a £400 deposit isn't even going to start not even get a skip outside the door, let alone get the people to turn around and start to lift it out. So you must learn as landlords that cheapest and it's not always the best. And I'm not saying the most expensive are the best, but work with a relationship with an agent that is actually got a vested interest, and you've actually made them feel that you value them to value your property. If you take a short-term view, which a lot of these people do, what happens is exactly what is happening in this picture. Tenants take advantage, agents are not interested, and guess who ends up paying? You might pay less at the beginning, but trust me, landlords, you will pay through the nose later. Why? Because you've got legal battles on your hand, you've got evictions on your hand, you've got rubbish to clean up, the property's been left in a bad state, you've got to go and repair it and get it sorted out, and so forth. And you might have 3 or 4 months worth of void period. And the question you ask yourself when you have that 3-month void period is, should I have paid my agent better at the beginning, and they look after it, and every 3 or 4 months they scheduled a viewing of the property, inspected it, did the right thing? Or do I go for the cheaper option? So, 2 parts of this. One is the agents are at fault for actually selling themselves cheap. The landlords are at fault for picking someone that is going to be cheap because they know they're not going to service it. And the only winner in this is the tenant, because he's only giving you a small deposit, he's stuck in the house, and as they say, possession is 9/10 of the law. The 2 people on the outside are fighting, and the chap on the inside is sitting there and enjoying himself, even though it may be in the glee of rubbish.
Yeah. So famously, Ogilvy, Mr. Ogilvy of Ogilvy and Mather, the big advertising agency, said one time, everyone gets the advertising agency they deserve. So you could say everyone gets the managing agent that they deserve. In other words, my question to you is, how do you find a good managing agent? Because to be honest with you, they could have friends in their pocket who could give them references and so on, and who knows whether they're going to be useful. But perhaps moving on from that point, what questions should you ask a managing agent when you're looking to place your property with them so that you can avoid this sort of thing?
I think a good question, Paul. And I think the question I would ask any managing agent is, how many properties they are managing. If they are managing a good portfolio, and a reference from another landlord is always a good way to do it. So if someone says to me, I want to, use you, or you want to go and do such and such, then, why will I use you? I'd say, well, I'm comfortable with what I do or can do, and, go and speak to XYZ. If you're comfortable in what you do, you should be able to be comfortable to say, I'm happy for you to have a number of a guy that I worked with for the last XYZ years, who will either tell you that, I am good or I'm bad. So, and we live in a world of reviews, don't we now? So if you look at the review situation, you will also find that a good agent and a good land or good tenant are going to get good reviews out of it. And if they're not getting those reviews, so there are some sort of like health checks that you could do. I'm not going to say that even the best of the best are going to be your right choice. There's a relationship to be built between landlord and agent, and there are some basic ground rules that you can actually, work and understand them on. But by beating them down and saying, well, actually, Fred Bloggs down the road charges me, twopence, and you're asking me for tenpence, I don't want to do that, then you're likely to say, well, go to the man with twopence, because you'll be back. The next time you come back, I'll be charging you 20 pence, not tenpence. Purely because of all the rubbish that you've got to sort out. Excuse the pun in the situation here. But the point is that, yeah, it's hard to find, but this story tells you a really good story about what is not right. And what is not right, as you rightly said, from Ogilvy and Ogilvy said, you get the marketing agency that you deserve. In this situation, the landlord obviously got the agent that they deserved, but it may not be, as my caveat would go, the agent's fault. It may be that the landlord has fallen out with the tenant, and as a result, the tenant has decided to treat the property as it is, and the victim or the messenger that is going to get shot is going to be the agent, because the landlord's going to have to blame someone. So he's not going to say, oh, actually, I fell out with him. I went round to his house and told him, if you don't tidy your rubbish up, I'm going to kick you out. So he said, okay, well, I'll actually bag more rubbish in there and leave it in there. You don't know that conversation's ever happened. I'm just using these as examples. They're not, realistic scenarios, but actually they can be realistic. These things that happen. But then the agent is the one that's going to suffer. So, I think that research is important to make sure that you get the right relationship going forward. And I don't think you'd have half the problems that people encounter. Yes, it's an extreme. That was an extreme, but they're not that. They happen often. These things, Paul. It's not like they don't happen. These things happen a lot, but it's still a best investment.
Absolutely. So some wise words as always, Joe. So thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you for watching our Property Matters show this week. We hope you'll join us again, of course, next week at the same time for another Property Matters.